Drop the weapon, or I shoot. The words cut through the late afternoon air like a blade, sharp and final, echoing off glass storefronts and idling cars as people froze mid-step on the sidewalk, caught between curiosity and fear, because in the center of it all stood a white police officer with his arm extended, his stance rigid, his voice louder than it needed to be, and just 10 feet away, a black man stood completely still, shoulders relaxed, hands visible, eyes steady in a way that didn't match the tension around him. And that was the first thing people noticed, not the gun, not the shouting, but the stillness, the kind that made you wonder what he knew that no one else did. Because imagine standing there, heart racing, a weapon pointed straight at you, and yet choosing not to move, not to argue, not even to flinch. The city noise seemed to fade into a low hum. Car horns distant, conversations cut short, phones slowly rising as strangers began recording what felt like something bigger than a routine stop. The officer took a step closer, his boots scraping against the pavement, his jaw tight, eyes locked with suspicion that had already made its decision. I said, "Get on your knees," he barked, louder now, as if volume could force control back into his hands. But the man didn't move, not out of defiance, not out of fear, but out of something else entirely, something quieter, deeper, like he had already measured this moment and found it lacking. His gaze didn't challenge the officer, it simply held. Its ground, calm, unwavering. And that calm began to spread, unsettling the crowd more than any sudden movement could. Whispers moved through the air like a current. "Why isn't he scared?" someone muttered, barely above a breath. And that question lingered, because fear was expected here. Fear made sense. Fear would have fit the script everyone had seen 100 times before. But this was different. The officer shifted again, his grip tightening, the space between them shrinking inch by inch. And yet the man's posture didn't change, his breathing steady, his presence grounded like he had stood in storms far worse than this. And maybe he had. Maybe this moment wasn't the peak of pressure for him. Maybe it wasn't even close. A breeze moved down the street, rustling loose paper and brushing against jackets. But still he stood there, unmoved, and somewhere in the distance, just faint enough to be overlooked, the low rumble of approaching engines began to rise, unnoticed by most, unheard by the officer whose focus had narrowed to a single point, a single decision, a single assumption. But the man heard it, or maybe he felt it, because something in his eyes shifted, not fear, not relief, just a quiet recognition, like a clock ticking toward a moment only. He could see coming, and as the tension stretched thinner and thinner, seconds feeling longer than they should, the crowd leaned in without realizing it, drawn into a scene they didn't fully understand yet, because what looked like control on one side was already slipping away. The sound grew louder now, no longer a distant hum but a presence pressing into the edges of the moment. Engines rolling in with a controlled urgency that did not match the chaos building on the sidewalk. Yet the officer did not turn, not yet, his focus locked forward, his voice rising again as if trying to drown out something he could not name. "Last warning," he said, each word tighter than the last. But the man in front of him remained exactly as he was, feet planted, shoulders loose, eyes steady. And there was something about that stillness that began to shift the air itself, like the scene was no longer moving forward but holding its breath, waiting. People in the crowd exchanged glances now, uncertain, sensing that whatever was happening had already gone beyond a simple misunderstanding. A woman lowered her phone slightly, her brow furrowed, as if she was trying to understand why the man being confronted looked more composed than the one holding authority. And that question spread quietly, unspoken but felt, because control was supposed to look loud, commanding, undeniable. But here it felt fragile, like it was balancing on something thin, something that could break without warning. The officer took another step, closer than before, the distance now almost gone, his shadow stretching across the pavement until it reached the man's shoes. But even then, there was no reaction, no retreat, no raised voice, only that same calm presence. And then the vehicles came into full view, black, polished, moving in precise formation, stopping not with chaos but with intention, doors opening. In unison, figures stepping out with a discipline that did not need to announce itself. And this time the crowd noticed, heads turning, whispers stopping mid-sentence, because something about the way those individuals moved did not belong to the randomness of the street. It belonged to order, to structure, to something higher than the noise that had filled the last few minutes. The officer finally glanced to the side, just for a second, just enough to see that what was arriving did not fit into the situation he thought he was controlling. And in that second, something shifted, not outside, but inside him, subtle, almost invisible, but real, because certainty had been replaced by doubt, and doubt has a way of changing everything. The man in front of him did not turn toward the vehicles, did not acknowledge them, not outwardly, but there was a quiet change in his posture, not relief, not tension, just a slight adjustment, like a moment aligning exactly as it was meant to, and then one of the arriving figures stepped forward, measured, composed, eyes scanning the scene not with confusion, but with recognition. And suddenly the space between everyone felt different, like the street itself had been divided into before and after, and the only thing left was the moment where those two worlds would collide. The man who stepped forward did not rush, did not raise his voice, did not demand attention, and yet every eye shifted toward him as if the air itself had made space. His uniform crisp, his posture precise, his presence carrying a weight that did not need explanation. And when he stopped just a few feet from the officer, there was a pause, not long, not dramatic, but enough to stretch the silence until it became something tangible, something heavy, the kind of silence that makes people hold their breath without realizing it. And then he spoke, calm, clear, controlled. "Officer, lower your weapon." Not as a suggestion, not as a plea, but as a statement that assumed it would be followed. And for the first time since this began, the officer hesitated, not visibly at first, just a slight tightening in his stance. A flicker in his eyes as his attention split between the man in front of him and the one he had been confronting, because something in that tone did not match the situation. He thought he understood. It did not match the script he had been following, and scripts, once broken, do not easily recover. The crowd felt it too. The shift, the moment where confidence turns into uncertainty, where authority starts asking questions it never needed to ask before, and the man who had stood silent all this time finally moved, not stepping back, not raising his hands higher, just a slight turn of his head, enough to acknowledge the presence that had arrived. His expression, unchanged, calm as ever. But now there was something else beneath it, not relief, not satisfaction, but recognition, like a chapter closing exactly when it was supposed to. And the uniformed figure standing between them took one more step forward, positioning himself not aggressively but deliberately, placing himself into the space that had once belonged entirely to the officer. And that alone was enough to redraw the boundaries of control. "Do you understand who you are speaking to?" he asked. Still calm, still measured. But now there was an edge, not sharp, not loud, just firm enough to leave no room for misinterpretation. The officer swallowed, his grip no longer as steady as it had been moments before, his voice lower now, less certain. "He has not identified himself," he replied, as if holding on to procedure could rebuild the certainty that was slipping through his fingers. But procedure depends on context, and context had just changed, completely. The uniformed man did not raise his voice, did not repeat himself. Instead, he simply turned his gaze toward the man who had remained still throughout it all. And in that glance, something unspoken passed between them, something the officer could not read, could not access. And that was the moment it truly shifted, not when the vehicles arrived, not when the crowd grew silent, but right there, in that quiet exchange, because power, real power, does not need to prove itself. It reveals itself, and once it does, everything that came before begins to fall apart. For a moment, no one moved, not the crowd, not the officer, not even the passing traffic that seemed to slow, as if the entire street had become aware of something larger unfolding. And the man at the center of it all, Marcus Hayes, finally shifted his gaze fully toward the uniformed figure who had stepped in, not with urgency, not with surprise, but with the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had expected this moment long before it arrived. And when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, almost effortless, at ease, just 2 words, but they carried a weight that did not need explanation, and the effect was immediate, subtle yet undeniable. The uniformed man straightened instinctively, his posture sharpening even further, while the others who had arrived behind him seemed to lock into place with silent precision, and that was when the realization began to spread, not all at once, but like a ripple moving outward through the crowd. Because people may not understand ranks or titles, but they understand presence. They understand when someone stands in a way that commands without asking, and the officer felt it too. Though he could not yet put it into words, his stance faltered just slightly, his arm lowering by an inch, then stopping as if caught between instinct and hesitation, his mind searching for something to hold onto, some rule, some justification, anything that could anchor him back into control. "Sir, I need identification," he said, but the words no longer carried the same force, no longer filled the space the way they had before, because now they sounded like a question trying to disguise itself as an order, and Marcus did not reach for anything, did not move his hands. Instead, he simply took a small step forward, not closing the distance aggressively, but enough to shift the dynamic entirely, enough to make it clear that he was no longer the one being assessed. And in that single step, the balance tipped, the officer's breath caught, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for the doubt to deepen, enough for the certainty to slip further away. And then the uniformed man beside him spoke again, this time with clarity that left no room for interpretation. "This is General Marcus Hayes." And the name settled into the air like something final, something irreversible. The kind of truth that does not argue, does not explain, it simply exists, and the effect was immediate. The officer's grip loosened, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, but enough for those watching closely to notice, enough for the tension that had built so tightly to begin unraveling. The crowd shifted, murmurs rising, phones tilting to capture a moment that had just transformed into something entirely different, because the story they thought they were witnessing was no longer the same, and the man they had seen standing quietly was no longer just a man. He was something else entirely, something the situation had failed to recognize until it was too late. And Marcus, still calm, still composed, met the officer's eyes one more time, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a quiet steadiness that spoke louder than anything else could, because in that moment, nothing needed to be proven anymore. Everything had already been revealed. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like a pressure releasing from the center outward, and Officer Daniel Brooks felt it before he understood it. The weight of every eye on him, now different than before, no longer watching a man in control, but a man being watched, evaluated, measured in a way he had not anticipated. His arm lowered another inch, then another, until the space between authority and uncertainty became impossible to ignore, and for the first time since the moment began, he took a step back, not ordered, not forced, just instinct, his voice quieter now, almost searching. "General, I did not know." The words sounded incomplete even as he said them, because they were not an explanation, not an excuse, just a realization arriving too late to change what had already happened. Marcus Hayes did not respond immediately. He did not rush to correct, did not raise his voice. Instead, he simply watched, his gaze steady, composed, as if giving the moment exactly what it needed, time. And that was what made it heavier, because in that stillness, there was no conflict left to hide behind, no tension to justify reaction, only truth standing plainly in the open. The uniformed officer beside Brooks stepped slightly forward, not aggressively, but with quiet authority, his tone firm. "We will take it from here." And that was all it took. No raised voices, no escalation, just a shift of control so clean it felt almost invisible. Brooks nodded once, stiffly, stepping aside fully now. The space he had occupied no longer his to command. The crowd exhaled collectively, a sound so subtle yet so present that it marked the end of something they had all felt building. Phones remained raised, but now the focus had changed, no longer capturing confrontation, but consequence. And Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm, measured, carrying without effort. "This is what happens when assumptions speak louder than facts." He did not direct it at Brooks alone, but the words landed there nonetheless, clear, undeniable. Brooks lowered his gaze, not out of submission, but out of recognition, the kind that comes when a moment redefines everything you thought you understood, and around them, the presence of the arriving personnel settled. into place, structured, controlled, restoring order not through force, but through clarity. The vehicles remained still, engines quiet now, as if even they understood their role had already been fulfilled, and Marcus adjusted his jacket slightly, a small, almost unnoticeable movement, but one that signaled closure, not of the situation, but of the imbalance that had defined it just moments ago. He turned slightly, preparing to leave, not in a hurry, not with urgency, but with the same calm that had carried him through the entire encounter. And as he walked past Brooks, he paused just long enough for one final moment to exist between them, not confrontation, not judgment, just presence. And then he continued forward, leaving behind a silence that felt different than before, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but resolved. And in that silence, one truth remained, clear and unshaken. Power does not always announce itself, but when it does, it changes everything. The street did not return to normal right away. It lingered in that strange space between what had happened and what it meant. People still standing where they were, phones slowly lowering, conversations beginning again but quieter now, more cautious, as if everyone understood they had just witnessed something that did not fit into everyday life. And Officer Daniel Brooks remained where he had stepped back, his posture no longer rigid, his hands no longer commanding, just resting at his sides. As he watched Marcus Hayes walk away, and there was a weight in that moment that no training manual had prepared him for, because this was not about procedure anymore. It was about perspective, about the split-second decisions that come from assumptions rather than understanding, and for the first time, he replayed it all in his mind, not as the officer giving orders, but as the man being seen, the tone of his voice, the certainty in his stance, the way he had already decided who Marcus was before a single word had been exchanged, and that realization settled heavily, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, the kind that stays with you long after the moment ends. One of the uniformed personnel approached him, not confrontational, not accusing, just present. "You are going to need to file a report," he said calmly, and Brooks nodded. The words simple, expected, but carrying a different meaning now, because reports are not just records, they are reflections, and this one would reflect more than just an encounter. It would reflect a moment where control shifted without force, where authority was redefined without a single raised voice. And Brooks glanced once more in the direction Marcus had gone, the figure now further down the street, blending back into the city as if nothing had happened. And that was the part that stayed with him the most. Not the arrival of the vehicles, not the presence of rank, but the composure, the restraint, the quiet certainty of someone who never needed to prove who he was. And around him, the scene began to dissolve, vehicles pulling away, personnel returning to their positions, the street slowly reclaiming its usual rhythm. But it was not the same, not entirely, because moments like this leave something behind, something unseen but undeniable. And Brooks finally turned, walking back toward his patrol car, his steps slower than before, not out of hesitation, but out of thought, deep, unavoidable thought. And as he reached for the door handle, he paused, just for a second, the noise of the city returning fully now, horns, voices, movement, life continuing as it always does. But inside that brief pause, one question remained, clear and unshaken. How many times had he been certain and been wrong? The door of the patrol car closed with a dull, final sound, but Officer Daniel Brooks did not start the engine right away, his hands resting on the steering wheel as the city moved around him like nothing had changed, pedestrians crossing, traffic lights shifting, voices blending back into the familiar rhythm of an ordinary day. Yet inside that small space, everything felt different, quieter, heavier, as if the moment he had just lived through had followed him in and refused to leave. And he sat there, replaying it again, not the way it had felt in the moment, but the way it looked. Now, from the outside, the raised voice, the certainty, the assumption built before a single fact had been confirmed, and for the first time, he noticed something he had missed before, not in Marcus Hayes, but in himself, the speed at which he had decided, the confidence that had come from habit rather than understanding. And that realization did not arrive like a shock. It settled slowly, like a weight you do not notice until you try to move. Outside, a group of bystanders lingered on the sidewalk, some still talking about what they had seen, others shaking their heads, their words drifting through the open air, fragments of disbelief, of reflection, of something deeper than curiosity, because moments like this do not stay contained. They spread, they echo, they turn into conversations that carry beyond the place they started, and Brooks knew that. He had seen it happen before, but this time, he was not just part of the story, he was the center of it, and that changed everything. His radio crackled softly, a routine call coming through, another situation, another moment waiting for a response, but he did not reach for it immediately, not because he was ignoring it, but because for the first time, he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of thought, deliberate, intentional thought, the kind that asks questions before taking action, and that pause, small as it was, marked a shift, subtle but real, because the difference between reaction and understanding often lives in a single second, and now, that second mattered. He finally picked up the radio, his voice steady, but different, less forceful, more measured, as if something inside him had adjusted, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to be noticed, enough to begin, and as he pulled away from the curb, the street behind him looked the same, buildings unchanged, sidewalks familiar, yet it no longer felt like the same place. Because what had happened there had left something behind, something unseen but undeniable, a reminder that authority is not just about control, it is about responsibility, about the weight of every decision made in moments that seem small, but are anything but. And as he drove forward into the flow of the city, one thought remained, steady and unshaken, not loud, not demanding, just present, guiding. If he had looked twice before acting once, how different would that moment have been? The city moved forward, but the moment did not disappear. It stretched beyond the street, beyond the bystanders, beyond the patrol car pulling into traffic, because stories like this do not end where they happen. They travel, they replay, they settle into places where people begin to ask questions they had ignored before, and somewhere across town, inside a quiet government building lined with polished floors and muted voices, Marcus Hayes stepped through a set of secured doors, his pace steady, his expression unchanged, as if the encounter from minutes ago had already been placed exactly where it belonged, behind him, filed not as something emotional, but as something understood, a reflection of a reality he had faced more times than most would ever realize. A junior officer walking past him straightened instinctively, offering a respectful nod, not exaggerated, not forced, just natural. Because recognition, when it is real, does not need to be announced, and Marcus acknowledged it. With the slightest movement of his head, continuing forward into a corridor where conversations lowered in volume as he passed, not out of fear, but out of awareness, and yet beneath that composed exterior, there was thought, not anger, not frustration, but reflection, the kind that comes from repetition, from patterns that reveal themselves over time, because what had happened out there was not new, it was familiar, the assumption, the immediate judgment, the need to prove something that should have never been questioned in the first place. And that familiarity carried a weight, not heavy enough to slow him down, but present enough to remind him why moments like that mattered, not for him, but for everyone watching, for the young man who had asked why he was not afraid, for the people who had recorded, who would replay it later, who would see not just what happened, but how it happened, the calm, the restraint, the choice to let truth reveal itself rather than force it. And as Marcus entered his office, the door closing softly behind him, the noise of the building faded, replaced by a quiet that allowed the moment to settle fully. He placed his keys on the desk, removed his jacket, and stood still for just a second, not because he needed to, but because he chose to, a pause that was not about the past few minutes, but about what they represented. And then he exhaled, slow, controlled, the kind of breath that does not release tension, but acknowledges it. And in that quiet space, one truth remained clear, unchanged, and unwavering. That dignity is not something given by others. It is something carried, even in moments when it is tested, even in moments when it is misunderstood, and out on the streets, in patrol cars, in crowded sidewalks and quiet offices, that truth continues to wait, patient, steady, for the next moment, when it will be seen again. The night settled quietly over the city, lights reflecting off glass and pavement as the day folded into something calmer, but not empty, Because what had happened earlier did not disappear with the fading sun. It lingered in conversations, in thoughts, in the quiet moments where people replayed what they had seen and tried to understand what it meant, and in a small office miles away from the street where it all began. Officer Daniel Brooks sat at his desk, the report in front of him still unfinished, the cursor blinking steadily on the screen as if waiting for something more than just words. Because this was not just another form to complete, not just another entry in a system designed to record events. This was a moment that required something different, something honest, and Brooks leaned back slightly, his eyes moving over the empty lines, not struggling to remember what happened, but deciding how to face it. Because the facts were simple, clear, undeniable, but the truth behind them was heavier. It was about judgment made too quickly, about certainty that came too easily, about a moment where authority had been used without understanding. And as he sat there, the sounds of the station moving around him, phones ringing, footsteps passing, voices exchanging routine information, he felt the distance between what had happened and what should have happened, not as a gap he could ignore, but as something he had to acknowledge, fully, and slowly. He began to type, not rushing, not filling the space just to move on, but choosing each word with care, because this time, the report was not just about describing actions, it was about recognizing them, understanding them, and taking responsibility for them. And across the city, in a different space entirely, Marcus Hayes stood near a window overlooking the skyline, the lights stretching into the distance like a reminder of how many lives, how many stories, how many moments were unfolding at once. And he remained still, not thinking about the confrontation itself, but about what it represented, about how many times similar moments had happened without being seen, without being recorded, without being understood, and yet he did not carry frustration, he carried clarity. The kind that comes from knowing that change does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it begins in quiet realizations, in small shifts of perspective, in moments where someone chooses to see differently than they did before. And as he looked out over the city, he understood that what happened that afternoon was not just about one officer or one encounter. It was about something larger, something ongoing, something that would continue long after this day ended. And back at the station, Brooks paused again, his hands resting on the keyboard, his reflection faintly visible in the darkened screen, and in that reflection, he saw not just the uniform, not just the role, but the person behind it, the one responsible for every decision, every action, every moment of judgment. And for the first time, that responsibility felt different, not heavier, but clearer. And as he finished the final line of the report, he exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that signals not an ending, but a beginning, because the next time would come. Another moment, another decision, another chance to choose differently. And somewhere between those two places, between the quiet office and the city lights, one truth remained, steady and undeniable. That real power is not proven in how quickly you act, but in how deeply you understand before you do.